Good morning, Weekend 110ers. I hope you got some good rest and that you're ready to go for this morning here. And we really hope that this weekend that you learn and you are able to hear from Jesus in new ways and ways that you hadn't planned on leading up to this weekend here. To help you in doing that, me and my dad have come up with a couple of character studies for you guys to talk through and discuss in your small groups at your host homes this morning. So we just want to encourage you to spend the next however long that you need, or however much time you want to spend on some of the questions that we're going to provide you and the stories that we're going to give you, to just discuss and talk about what these characters look like to you, what they mean to you, how they connect with you, how maybe you can relate to these people. So we want to encourage you that find a comfy spot, get circled around the TV or computer or cell phone that you're watching on, and just spend some time here letting God speak to you.
Well, good morning. Like Josh said, we have the opportunity to pick a couple characters out of the Bible and talk about stories and how that relates to our live, love, and serve like Jesus did. And when I got to thinking about that, I was trying to figure out which character I would want to pick from, and I went back to one of my favorite stories in the Bible, and which the character would be Peter. And I chose Peter a lot because I think I can associate with him. Peter seems like a character that, from the Bible, a disciple that sometimes spoke when maybe it wasn't the right thing to say, and got reprimanded a few times by Jesus when he said something that Jesus didn't appreciate. Jesus turns to him and says, "Get behind me, Satan," because it didn't go with what God wanted. And I can feel that way in my life, times when I may say something when I shouldn't and didn't think it through real well. And in times where Peter just reacts, like for instance, in the garden when Jesus is being arrested, and they go to grab him, and Peter draws his knife and cuts off the ear of the high priest's servant, and Jesus tells him to put it away and not to use a sword, or you'll die by the sword. And so he seems like a man that, a lot like myself, sometimes reacts differently, and maybe yourself. How do you react when things are going on in life, thinking through them, and just kind of a normal guy? But yet, the story, my favorite story, and the reason I picked the character, comes along the lines in Matthew 14, where Jesus has just gotten done feeding the 5,000 and does this miraculous miracle after teaching 5,000 men. Who knows how many other people, the women and children, were there. And he feeds all of them, and they're exhausted. And Jesus is going to go off in the mountains and pray. And he sends the disciples off in a boat. And they go out in the boat, and you can imagine they're wondering how Jesus is going to meet with them and how they're going to get caught up. And gets to be late in the night, and the disciples are on this boat, and they see Jesus walking across the lake, and they're freaked out at first of, what is this? And is it a ghost? And they finally put two and two together and figure out it's Jesus, obviously. And Peter calls out to him and says, "Hey, if it's you, Jesus, have me say the words and I'll come out to you." And I think that's the part for me that I hope when you guys think about the things Jesus wants you to do, are you willing to ask, "Hey Jesus, if it's you, come out"? But then the part that for me makes it the favorite part of the story is Peter actually climbs over the edge of the boat and steps into that water where the waves are rushing, and he starts walking towards Jesus. Something we're all supposed to do, and oftentimes it's difficult. And then you think about those difficult times we get into, and the first thing we do is rely back on our own selves, a lot like Peter has done in some of the things he did in the stories from the Bible. And he takes his eyes off of Jesus for a minute and starts to sink. And I think that relates a lot to our lives, as if you're not focused on Jesus, the tendency is to sink and fall away. And Jesus reaches out when he calls up to him and saves him and rescues him. And again, that same principle of all we have to do is call out to Jesus, and he's there to help us. The story for me, I guess, that makes it my favorite is that here's a guy that doesn't do everything right, but yet he gets it, meaning his faith is big enough that he's willing to get out of the boat and walk towards Jesus, even though he may sink, and he does. And I think that's the part that's so cool to me, is that here's a guy that I can relate to. And oftentimes I feel like I do things that Jesus is going to discipline me for, and yet Jesus is always there and always takes me alongside and directs my path again. And I think that's the part I hope that you can put yourself in. Where are you at with Jesus today? If Jesus asked you to do something, would you get out of the boat? Do you have what it takes to say, sink or swim? I'm willing to get out of the boat and walk after Jesus. You know, when it goes to school and talking to friends, or your neighborhood, or sporting event, are you willing to have those hard conversations and know that Jesus has got your back when you go?
Good morning again, Josh here. I got the privilege of choosing another character to discuss this morning. I'm going to choose a character that I'm sure every single person in your group has probably heard of. Very common, a character that, and as well as the story I'm going to cover, is one that you've learned all the way probably from like preschool on up. This character, if you haven't been able to kind of guess a couple of them, is Daniel. And the reason I chose Daniel is because I want you to try to connect your life with his and see kind of the things that he was put up against, and see if you think that in a similar scenario or in your life currently, if these things were to happen to you, would you respond the same way that Daniel did throughout the story here. So we're going to be in Daniel chapter 6, most of the chapter here. So if you did bring your Bibles, I encourage you as you're in your groups here that you can follow along with me. I'm not necessarily going to read it word for word, but you can check out Daniel chapter 6 as we're kind of going through this. So Daniel, he's a guy that's serving under King Darius, and King Darius has appointed essentially 120 people that are going to be in government, that are going to be in charge of other people, and kind of overseers of his kingdom. And one of those 120 obviously was Daniel. And over those 120, he also put 3 administrators, 3 people that he thought were even more trustworthy and important than the 120 they chose before that. And as you can guess, probably Daniel's one of those 3. And even more so than that, Daniel continued to distinguish himself even as being just a man that was a good leader, that was trustworthy, that was kind, that, you know, when he said he was going to get something done, he'd do it. And so above those 3 of those people, King Darius even put Daniel in higher regards than anybody else. It even says here in verse 3 or actually in verse 4, that King Darius' plan was to put Daniel in charge of the entire kingdom at some point. So as you can see, Daniel was thought very highly of by King Darius. And by doing that, he made his co-workers, I'll call them, very jealous and upset, because obviously they realized that King Darius really liked Daniel, and that Daniel was a good guy, a guy that was a good leader, and they were jealous of that. They wanted to be in charge. They wanted to have the highest level spot, and so for that they started to really dislike Daniel. And so they started off by trying to figure out ways that they could get Daniel to be in trouble. Ways that they could go to the king and say, hey, look at this Daniel guy. He's not as good of a guy as you think he is. And so they went and did this, and they came back and they're like, we can't find anything wrong about this Daniel guy. There's no corruption in him. He's completely trustworthy. We can't find a single bit of corruption. We can't find anything wrong with this guy. I mean, he is like the perfect dude, besides obviously Jesus coming, but he is the guy that obviously there's a reason why King Darius liked him, right? And just to pause on the story for a second, I want you to think about that about yourself. Is that something that you are? Are you that trustworthy? Are you that lacking corruption that somebody couldn't find a fault in you to point a finger at? That's a tough thing to do. I think it's a tough way it's tough to live in a life that's that above reproach. So they can't find anything wrong with Daniel, and so they decide, you know what, we're going to have to do something else. We know that this Daniel guy, we know that he loves Jesus, or at this time he loves God, and we're going to have to go and do something against his belief in God, because everything else about him, we can't find anything wrong. So they went and they devised this plan that they went up to King Darius, and they essentially were like, King Darius, you are the greatest king ever. You are the best thing since buttered bread, and we love you, and you deserve all but the praise. Nobody should, because of how good you are, nobody should praise anybody else. And as a king, what do you think King Darius thought? He's like, that sounds pretty good. I like that. I like the sounds of that. So he's like, yeah, let's go through with this. And so the rest of these satraps and these governors, they're like, okay, well, how about we make a decree or a rule that for 30 days nobody can worship anybody besides you, King Darius. And King Darius again was like, I like that. I like the rules of that. And so he sealed it off, saying that this is an official law now, and that for the next 30 days, anybody that worshipped anybody besides King Darius would have to face the consequences of being thrown into a lion's den. Now, as we go through here and we look at the story here, we kind of jump up here into verse 10, if you're following along, Daniel 6, verse 10. When Daniel learned about this document being signed, what do you think he did? Stop doing things, stop praying, maybe hid in his room, pretended like he didn't know you? No, it says very particularly here in verse 10, he went into his house, and this is even funnier. The windows in this upper room opened up towards Jerusalem. He didn't even go to a hidden room. And 3 times a day prior to this decree coming, he would go down on his hands and knees and he'd pray and give thanks to God. So even after this thing happens, he didn't change anything that he did. He did the exact same thing. Even though he knew that the risk of him doing this and getting caught was getting thrown into a lion's den, he continued to do it anyway. And so he still went on up 3 times that day, opened up his windows, faced Jerusalem, and went down on his hands and knees and prayed. And he prayed to God just the same as he always had. And of course, these other guys that were trying to find something wrong with him said they were watching. And so they caught him. And they said, Daniel, you're in trouble. We're going to take you up to King Darius, and you're going to have to get thrown into the lion's den. And Daniel, being the man that he was and believing the faith that he had, he knew that good or bad, this is what he was supposed to do. He wasn't supposed to hide away from his faith. He wasn't supposed to pretend that he didn't know God. He just lived his life, and he continued to live it up into even facing death, being thrown into a lion's den. And so he got up to the king, and the King Darius saw him, and it says here that the king was sad. He was sad that this was Daniel, because he thought Daniel was a great leader. He loved Daniel, and but he answered and he created this decree, so he had to follow through with it. And so he followed through with giving Daniel throwing into a lion's den. And it says here that the lions were not well fed. They would things that were thrown into the lion's den wouldn't even reach the floor of the den. That's how hungry these things were. And so Daniel, he got thrown into the lion's den. And we don't really know what it looked like for the day that he was in there, but he was in there, and essentially he was just hanging out with these big lions and spent the night with them. I don't know, maybe he was using them as a pillow, or he was hiding in the corner, who knows. But what we do know is that Daniel didn't die in the lion's den. And the next day, King Darius comes back, and he is sad. He pretty certain that Daniel has died, because these lions are hungry, and he was fed to them. Well, he opens up the den, and he sees Daniel there. And when he sees Daniel there, he's like, whatever this God is that you serve, we as Jerusalem now need to serve this God, because we've seen the power of what he can do. We've seen this God that you serve is the true God. And through Daniel's faith in this, we see that he wasn't afraid of death. He wasn't afraid of breaking the rules. He didn't change his life when a new law came into place. Now, in our lives now, it's not illegal for us to go to church here in the United States, or at least not currently. But it is kind of frowned upon to have a religious belief, or at least to share your religion. A lot of people will say, hey, you shouldn't talk about it. It's okay if you believe that, but don't tell me to believe that, or don't make me think that, or don't make me believe those things. And I think we can relate to that a lot, because that's super common in today's culture right now. And I want to ask you here, and then we'll just kind of break off into questions here, but is that how you're living? Or are you hiding behind that? Are you afraid to tell people what your beliefs are? Are you willing to stand up for what you think is right or wrong? Are you willing to do those things even knowing that you could lose friends? You could you'd be cast away from your group of friends. Maybe you could get in trouble at school. Maybe, I don't know. But are you willing to stand up for what you believe in and continue to live the life that you are for Jesus? And I want you to think about that this weekend and leading up to that, and living a life as Jesus would live. And I think that's the life of Daniel. And I think if we can look back at the life of Daniel, it's a powerful character. So enjoy your conversation, and